Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going back to Victorian England to explore the life of Fredrick Hockley. A man who, well, he lived a fascinating double life.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine this. By day, he was your typical middle-class professional. But secretly, he was a passionate occultist.
Fascinating.
And get this, his story was almost lost to history.
Oh, no.
It was only after his death that a publisher bought his entire library and, well, they stumbled upon all these boxes.
What was in the boxes?
His personal notes, including tons of transcripts from his crystal gazing sessions.
Wow. It's amazing what those manuscripts reveal, not just about Hockley himself, but also about the anxieties and spiritual yearnings of the Victorian era.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we're talking decades worth of material here. Letters, published articles, and those incredible crystal gazing records. They span over 30 volumes.
Is that a lot?
Over 12,000 answers.
Wow.
So today we're going to unpack all of it and see if we can understand Hockley's worldview. You know, how he used these practices to explore what he called the other side.
One of the first things that struck me was the sheer volume of his occult collection. Thousands of books and manuscripts on topics like alchemy, Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism.
So this wasn't just a passing interest for him.
No, not at all. It was a lifelong obsession.
It makes you wonder what drove him to dive so deep into all of that, right?
Well, his letters kind of paint a picture of a man who was constantly on the move, attending seances, meeting with other occultists, always searching for more knowledge.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah, actually, he even suffered from insomnia and some health problems.
Right.
Some people think it was because of the years of intense study and, well, his involvement in these practices.
So a truly dedicated seeker. But let's talk about the crystal gazing. How did that work exactly? And I know you mentioned that he didn't actually see the visions himself.
Right. Hockley actually employed seers, mostly women, who would gaze into these specially prepared crystals.
Specially prepared.
Yeah. Each crystal was dedicated to a specific spirit, and the seer would describe what they saw, what appeared within the crystal.
So it was like a window.
Exactly. Think of it like a window to the spirit world, but one that Hockley needed someone else to look through for him.
So maybe instead of saying seer, we should say seeress.
Right.
Like a female medium who acts as this conduit between Hockley and the spirit world.
Yeah.
So what kind of questions did he ask these spirits through the crystal?
Oh, everything. It seemed like his curiosity knew no bounds. He asked about things like the nature of the Urim and Thummim, the composition of gold, everlasting torment, angels, guardian spirits.
Like he was compiling this encyclopedia of the spirit world.
Exactly.
And that question about the Urim and Thummim, that's particularly interesting, don't you think? Because this was a time when people were really questioning traditional religious beliefs, especially with all the new scientific discoveries that were happening.
It's true. And the Urim and Thummim, these ancient objects used for divination, they would have held a lot of mystery, a lot of power for someone like Hockley. It's like he was searching for that ancient wisdom to make sense of this rapidly changing world.
Right. It definitely makes you think about how people grapple with faith and doubt even today. But let's get back to the crystal gazing for a second. You mentioned that Hockley believed in a hierarchy of spirits. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. He described different orders of spirits, everything from lower-level atmospheric spirits to the more powerful guardian spirits and even higher beings. And each type of spirit, well, they had to be invoked in a specific way. Hockley was very methodical in his approach, carefully documenting all the rituals and incantations that he used.
He even used this term discharge
Oh, yes.
to describe the process of making sure that the spirit left the crystal after each session. It almost sounds like he was afraid of accidentally trapping a spirit in there.
Well, I think it just speaks to the level of seriousness that he approached these practices with. He believed that these were real entities he was dealing with, and he wanted to make sure that everything was done correctly. For his safety, but also out of respect for the spirits themselves.
So we have this picture of Hockley as a very meticulous, almost scientific occultist. He was clearly fascinated by how the spirit world worked, but he wasn't just playing around with it. He had rules, he had procedures, and he had a deep respect for the forces that he was interacting with. What do you think? Does it surprise you at all?
One of the most fascinating examples of Hockley's meticulousness is the sheer volume of those crystal-gazing transcripts that he kept. He documented over 12,000 answers from these sessions. Imagine that 12,000. He really recorded everything, from the mundane details to, well, the most profound revelations.
12,000 answers.
Yeah.
That's wild. And it wasn't just abstract philosophical questions he was asking, right?
No.
He also consulted spirits for very practical advice,
Oh, absolutely.
like even for things like his health.
Yeah, there's actually a record of him trying to use crystal gazing to help a friend who was dealing with really bad insomnia. And he was known to consult with experts in more unconventional medicine, too, like that famous somnambulist Adolphe de Didier, to try and find solutions for his own ailments.
Oh, wow. So this connects to that whole Victorian fascination with alternative medicine, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like there was this growing distrust of those traditional medical practices.
Well, for sure. It was a time of massive change. People were questioning established institutions everywhere you looked. And Hockley, with his interest in ancient wisdom and spiritual practices, was definitely part of that.
He was also really into herbal remedies.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly the herb rue. There's even this one instance where he asked his friend's son, Herbert, to copy out an ancient recipe from a manuscript. Can you imagine that? Getting a handwritten herbal remedy from a Victorian occultist.
That's amazing. It really gives you a sense of, the time, doesn't it? And actually, speaking of Herbert, he played a really important role in Hockley's life. They were really close, almost like mentor and student. Hockley even warned Herbert about the potential dangers of spirit communication, saying that it could really take a toll on your health.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. It shows a different side to Hockley, doesn't it? A bit more of a caring, paternal side. It's a good reminder that even these figures who seemed larger than life were still just, human. They had their own anxieties and concerns.
Right. And it's interesting how he was willing to share his knowledge, even if it meant revealing these potentially dangerous secrets. He wasn't hoarding his discoveries just for himself, He wanted other people to benefit, but he also wanted them to be aware of the risks.
So he wasn't blindly leading people into the occult.
Exactly.
Which leads us to another fascinating part of Hockley's life, his involvement with the Rosicrucians. You mentioned that he was really involved with the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, the SRIA.
Yes, and his letters and notes actually give us some incredible insights into that pretty secretive society. He served as the secretary for the Grand Steward's Lodge, so he was clearly a well-respected member. And we get glimpses of their rituals, their symbols, their beliefs, all through his writing.
It sounds like he was really drawn to the idea of connecting with a like-minded community. It wasn't just this solitary pursuit for him. He actively sought out others who shared his interests.
It's true, and it wasn't always, easy. He actually had a falling out with one fellow Rosicrucian, Kenneth R.H. Mackenzie, although thankfully they resolved their differences later on. It's a good reminder that even in these kind of esoteric circles, human relationships were still complex and sometimes messy.
It added a little bit of real-world drama to the whole story.
Right.
And speaking of drama, we can't forget that incredible account of Hockley's crystal gazing session with Richard Burton, the famous explorer and translator.
Oh, yes. That's a legendary episode in the world of, occult history. Hockley Seeress accurately described Burton's situation in Arabia, even though Burton was literally thousands of miles away at the time.
No way.
She saw him in this, heated dispute with a group of Bedouins. And her description was so detailed, she even noted Burton's Arab attire and the specific weapons that were involved. And later, Burton himself confirmed how accurate the vision was. He even signed Hockley's written account of it, just as verification.
It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the whole idea of clairvoyance and the nature of time and space, What do you make of it?
It's certainly a compelling story, and it has been used, by a lot of people as evidence of real psychic ability. But it also raises some really interesting questions about the role of the seeress in Hockley's practices. Were they simply these passive conduits for information, or did they actually play a more active role in, shaping those visions that they were perceiving?
That's a great question. It's kind of like that idea of the observer effect in quantum mechanics, right?
Yeah,
the act of observing something can actually change the thing being observed.
Exactly. And in this case, both Hockley and the seeress were, observers. And their shared beliefs and expectations could have actually influenced what they saw in the crystal.
It's like a whole other layer of complexity to this story. So we have this picture of Hockley, the meticulous researcher, the Rosicrucian initiate, and someone who seemed to genuinely believe in the power of communicating with spirits. But even beyond the specific details, of his practices, what I find fascinating is the glimpse we get into the mindset of a Victorian occultist.
Yeah.
It's like peering into this, hidden world,
It's remarkable, isn't it, just how deep his interest ran. This wasn't just some, like, casual experimentation for him. He was systematically studying and meticulously documenting his findings. His
Yeah.
manuscripts are, like, overflowing with detailed descriptions of rituals, complex symbols, spirit
It's a
hierarchy.
lot to take
Oh,
in.
absolutely. Deep philosophical concepts.
He even designed his own, like, elaborate crystal gazing apparatus, right, with specific instructions for consecration and use.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about, like, spooky thrills for him. This was serious, a dedicated endeavor.
And to really understand the significance of all of this, I think we have to remember, the historical context. Victorian England was a time of immense change and upheaval. Industrialization, urbanization, rapid scientific advancements, all happening at once. And it really led to a lot of, religious questioning and a search for meaning in a world that was changing faster than anyone could really keep up with.
So for Hockley, could the occult have been a way to find, like, grounding and understanding in all that chaos, a way to connect with something beyond, the rapidly shifting material world?
I think so. It wasn't just about gaining knowledge, it was about seeking guidance, grappling with the mysteries of life and death, and ultimately kind of carving out his own path to truth and meaning. It's a yearning that I think resonates even today.
I agree. We're still fascinated by those big questions, aren't we? It's just fascinating how his work reflects the anxieties and those spiritual yearnings of, his era.
It was a real resurgence, of interest in all things spiritual and mystical, sort of like a reaction, I think, to the limitations that people saw in, traditional religion and even in the burgeoning field of science.
People were attending seances, they were experimenting with hypnosis, exploring new belief systems,
Exactly.
and Hockley was right there in the middle of it all, documenting his experiences, sharing his insights, and ultimately leaving this, like, incredible legacy behind for us to learn from.
His manuscripts are like these time capsules, and they challenge our assumptions about rationality, spirituality, and even the boundaries of human perception.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and work of Fredrick Hockley, what stands out to you as the most significant aspect of his story?
I think for me, it's his sheer dedication and that meticulousness that he brought to his studies. This wasn't just a passive believer, He was an active seeker, always questioning, experimenting, meticulously recording all of his findings, a true pioneer, exploring the uncharted territories of the human mind and spirit.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we had access to a crystal seer like Hockley, what one question would we ask to gain insight into the mysteries of life, the universe, or even our own personal journeys?
That's a question worth pondering. And maybe, it's an invitation for all of us to tap into our own sense of wonder and curiosity, to explore those mysteries that lie just beyond, our everyday perception. Who knows what we might discover if we dare to look beyond the veil.